Creating stories and scenes with your art from your imagination is a huge challenge for the aspiring artist. It took me quite a while to really figure this out and, get my ability to a point where I could draw scenes from my imagination. I always had these things rattling around in my head. I would be, inspired by manga and comics and video games, and I'd want to sort of draw these scenes from stories that I had myself. One of the things that I found would sort of help me the most in this endeavor was, thumbnailing. Essentially, letting myself brainstorm and, come up with ideas and iterate on these ideas and figure out kind of how to make them better. But also how to use this to kind of develop those ideas and sort of think through them on the page. One of the biggest tricks I'll share with you right now is that it takes a long time to figure out how the medium that you're using, how this two-dimensional page will actually receive your ideas. Not all ideas you can have will work well. A great tip that I often have is that people in the beginning kind of think in motion. You think in movies, but an illustration or a comic or a manga is a series of static pictures, and it's a challenge in the beginning to figure out how to kind of begin to think in static images and figure out how to create movement and dynamism on a static two-dimensional page. So you have to work through this. That's a lot of tricks and things that you have to sort of experiment with. And thumbnails is one of the best ways for you to do this quickly and effectively. What I want to focus on in this video is a drawing lesson where we dive into these topics in a little bit more detail. I'll share with you my process and my general thoughts for creating thumbnails and coming up with stories through this, especially in this case when we're dealing with, more detailed scenes where something's actually going on. We've got multiple characters, we've got backgrounds, and we need to sort of combine all these things. I'll also share with you some basic tips for how to come up with sort of simple stories that will sort of normally work. And I'll also share with you, some basic compositional tips and, again, my general advice for how to get this done. We'll also take a look at a few sort of examples in the beginning of other artists who have used thumbnails so we can kind of see how this can work for other, instances. And we'll also sort of take a look at, what, books like Andrew Loomis's Creative Illustration talk about when it comes to, composition and sort of planning your images. Likewise, we'll briefly check out a couple of other really good resources such as Edgar Payne's Composition of Outdoor Painting, and we'll sort of check out his work to talk about the difference between, again, what I'm going to be talking about, which is sort of narrative, comic book, manga, story illustration, and these kind of, amazing, more abstract compositions where we're dealing with sort of landscapes and things that don't have an inherent story. Again, the difference between these is important, and I really want to cover that in this lesson. The key here is to unlock your imagination. When I started doing this, I would often be thumbnailing and coming up with ideas that were well beyond my ability to execute and actually turn into a finished illustration. That's okay, because we can always go back to them, and we can always use this as a way to catalog our ideas, to explore them, and to figure out what is and isn't possible, how to sort of bring that imagination to the fore. Anyway, this is a fun topic, but it's quite lengthy, so let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name's Tim McBurney. I've been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Now, normally when I finished with my thumbnail, what I do is turn it into a finished illustration using the line and color style. Again, you've probably seen some of those sort of images pop up here. That's typically how I work, and it's the same method that I use for creating, all my comic books and a lot of sort of the concept art and other art that I create. Now, if you want to learn a little bit more about that process, you can check out my free quick start guide. It's aimed to get you up and running quickly, creating your own line and color style in Photoshop. I really focus on creating a reliable, simple process that you can sort of use to just sort of quickly get up and running and start creating images with. I go over the thumbnailing to the finished process, and I'll also give you all of the brushes and PSDs and things that I tend to use day to day. It's free, link will be in the description. go check it out. Now, turning one of these thumbnails into a finished image is its own challenge. But what I want to talk about really and focus on is, again, the brainstorming and the creativity that you can get into through this process. There are other tutorials on this channel that sort of show how I go through the whole process and create a finished illustration. And I suggest you check those out if you haven't already. But what I do find is that this process of thumbnailing, coming up with ideas, can be satisfying in and of itself. Often if you're time strapped and you don't have the time to finish an illustration, but you have ideas, this can be a really good way to record those and kind of get that creative sort of catharsis to sort of complete itself, right? To feel like, oh, okay, I got those ideas out of my head. And I found that to be really useful. Again, as I said, I've often gone back to them over the years, but again, it can be valuable just to kind of get the ideas out, to experiment, to put them down on the page, to make them real. Anyway, as you can tell, I could probably go on and on about this indefinitely, but really I want to show you how I do this when I'm sort of thumbnailing these scenes and really sort of try and track that creative process and the thought process a little bit more. So let's jump over to the drawing table and get stuck in. All right, here we are at the drawing table. Now, firstly, I just want to give a little bit of an introduction where we can sort of see what's going on, and I can show you some examples, again, both to demonstrate how other people are using these techniques and also to, sort of share and remind us of some of the other videos that I've made that are similar. So firstly, again, worth noting, there's a couple of other videos on the channel if you haven't checked them out already. And I think one that is very relevant to this topic of, drawing scenes via thumbnail is where I was sort of creating these scenes, which is maybe something that you might want to look at if you are wanting to do some extra development work before you start thumbnailing, or to include this type of work in your thumbnailing sort of ritual where you sit down and do this. The idea here is, obviously, as I said in this video, that you can kind of think through the image by drawing it from above and different angles and using this to essentially block out the action before you get too deep into the weeds in sort of how we make that look good. So I think that might be something that's definitely worth looking into as well. And I have talked previously about creating scenes for smaller images, right, where maybe you're just kind of planning to do portraits or something similar. And again, I think this idea applies to all those things. But again, today we really want to dig into the scenes aspect of it. So just firstly, I'm going to be drawing with a matte Blackwing. I have a 2-stage sharpener. I will probably have a kneadable eraser or putty eraser of some kind. And I'm drawing on this paper, which is a Strathmore 400 series drawing paper. So this is a 400 series drawing paper, and it's a smooth surface, and it's just kind of a big pad, right? Again, 14 by 17 inches, which is again a nice sort of big one. Again, I've talked about how to set up your drawing surface and those kind of things. Even though, again, it can be good to be able to rotate your paper, I do find that just drawing on one of these is really good. Again, very easy for me to go back and reference all the other sketches I've done, which is important because often when you are, just sort of creating these images, you want to be able to quickly reference them. Here we go. So in this instance, I've got an example of an easily accessible set of thumbnails that I've done before for different scenes. And this is really what we're going to do as a demo in this video. And what I sort of tend to do is just kind of fill up sketchbooks and make part of my sketching ritual about ideas. Now, it's really important, or I found it very useful, to separate out these topics and sort of spend some of my time focusing on what is the best thing to draw, what is the best idea that I can come up with, versus thinking about, how am I going to execute this? So the basic idea here is that if I'm able to mess around and sketch around and have fun doing this, then that means I'm not really thinking at this phase, can I actually draw this, right? Is this too much for me to bite off? Should I make this easier? You can just kind of let your imagination fly and really focus on the ideas and the story. I have a lot of images and thumbnails that I planned decades ago that I kind of knew at the time I never really would be able to do justice to. But again, I've still got them, and as my drawing ability has improved, now I kind of know that I can go back to some of those ideas and again, maybe refine that thumbnail, refine that idea that I had. And that's been a really good way to sort of revisit some of those other creative thoughts that I've had over the years. I actually find, again, as I get older, that is something that's really, really interesting to do. And I've found often the results are very interesting to go back to ideas that I did have, mix them with sensibilities that I do have now, and really kind of often come up with something that's quite interesting and unique. So if we look at some of these images, we can see the execution of them on on following pages. So this is this idea here, which again, at the it's hard for maybe you to see exactly what's meant to be going on in here, but I had a pretty good idea. I sort of went on with the story idea that again I'd have this character and they're wandering around, they're meeting different people, and this was a case where this character's maybe met some sort of other character who lives in the wood in this kind of sort of witch's hut or something like that. So again, that's the simple idea, and this took quite a bit of time to sort of execute on, but all of these images are there, and I think I've drawn like quite a few of them. Again, this one is based on this. So as I always say with these types of thumbnails, you don't have to, they don't have to 100% of the time make sense, right? To a certain degree, if I sort of looked at this now, this would be not necessarily the most interesting one, but at the time, I had a pretty good idea about, sort of what was actually meant to be there. Some of them will kind of hold up better than others, but again, that's totally fine. And again, you can see this one here is this one here. And really, it's interesting, though, that I do find I can often go back to these later and really find that, I either see exactly what I was trying to do at that point in time, or, I see something new and I'm sort of inspired to draw nonetheless. So this is something that, I'm sort of pretty passionate about as a creative option for artists, and something I found really useful for, my own development. And I can just sort of share with you, again, a few examples of where you might sort of see people do that. I'm often sort of talking about Frank Frazetta as a really, really good example of someone who has, examples of this type of work that we can see. And again, I think what you find often is, again, similar types of ideas and process. You have a mix of kind of sketches like this. And that's something else that's important to remember is, not all of your sketches are going to be amazing. I'm often trying to, and people are often trying to put their best sketches forward, and sort of show you the good ones. In some cases, it takes a while to kind of find that sort of perfect image, right? But again, you can see here that there's plenty of examples of how this kind of process progresses on, right? And we sort of see the thumbnail, right? The ideation, iteration, and you can actually see this is probably scanned from a page that was a little bit transparent. You can see some sort of dinosaur sketches on the back of that. And again, I think this is a really, really important point to make. Now, these images are obviously done for commercial purposes, and I think this is a great book just in general to kind of see Frazetta's process. But these are obviously done with some sort of illustration in mind, right? But the idea of doing sketches and those kind of things is something that you find in a lot of books. Creative illustration by Andrew Loomis is something that often talks about how you will plan your images, right? So in this case, this is talking about thumbnailing, and specifically in this instance, planning tonal patterns or arrangements. And, I really recommend once you get going with your own thumbnailing and coming up with ideas to kind of delve into these aspects of picture making so that when you're thumbnailing, you can maybe include some of those in your plans as well, right? So again, this is a multi-layered thing. Really, the most important thing to begin with is just to focus on your ideas, right? And getting your ideas onto the page in some way, shape, or form. But certainly, there's a lot of information on how to sort of make this better. Now, I think it's important also to state that, again, a good way I like to define imagery is to divide it into sort of narrative or sort of abstract terms. And a narrative is where we have an obvious story that we're trying to tell. And what I find often with a narrative sort of story or composition that we're trying to tell is that we don't need as much abstraction. We don't need to really sort of plan that aspect of it as much, because often the story will kind of carry us through and give us a lot of things to look at and a lot of things that we need to actually, sublimate to, make sure that the main story comes forward. So the story comes first when we're talking about narrative story illustrations. If you're looking more in terms of, how do I make stuff look good, which is kind of what illustration, is about, then again, you can look at a lot of the classic sort of texts. So here we've got sort of Edgar Payne's Composition of Outdoor Painting, which is a classic compositional sort of textbook, essentially. And, this is a very, very old book, but it really is where, again, a lot of these basic ideas were, maybe first started to be talked about in print and sort of discussed. And I think here what you'll sort of notice is, again, like the real sort of focus on, developing good shapes, making it look interesting on an abstract level. Now, again, it's important to remember that if you're doing landscapes or images that don't necessarily have a big story component, you do need to focus on these abstract compositional elements in order to make them look interesting. And if, again, we'll do some more stuff on this in some other videos at some sort of later date, but certainly if you do look at Edgar Payne's work, you can really see that this works, right? His ability to create just amazing looking images on an abstract level, arranging these light and dark elements and, this sense of balance, right? This sort of abstraction is just absolutely amazing. The light, the dark, the color, and you can see that when you sort of observe a lot of those little thumbnails, both in the Loomis book and in, Edgar Payne's actual sort of book on composition. And this is important to master, but not necessarily what I'm going to be talking about today, because this teaches you how to make anything interesting. And I think it really should give you confidence that if you're just painting mountains, right, you can paint them well or you can paint them excellently, right? You can make almost anything abstractly interesting to the human eye. Now, what do we mean by sort of abstractly interesting, and what's the difference there? Well, essentially a lot of these, paintings that, again, Edgar Payne, I think, is a really, really great example. The best way that someone sort of explained this to me, and I think it was actually Craig Mullins on a forum years and years ago, is that it should still look interesting if you turn it upside down, right? That to me is the definition of an abstract painting that's successful, right? It kind of doesn't really matter how you view it. Your eye is just like, oh, that's interesting. So when we think about composition and sort of improving your composition, again, firstly, remember, it's not just a matter of watching a 5-minute YouTube video that sort of goes through the top 10 compositional rules or looking at a Fibonacci spiral or something like that. This, like all elements of art, is a lifelong pursuit, and it requires a lot of sort of study, experimentation, and for you to really find how your voice interacts with all these kind of concepts, and you create images that are very sort of specific to you, but also are very nice to look at. But again, just keep in mind that often what I'm talking about is a little bit more based on you getting your ideas, right? Your imagination onto the page. And often, when I'm doing that, I'm trying to employ a lot of those concepts that you might think about when you consider, composition. But mostly what I'm trying to do is kind of tell a little story, because I draw comics and concept art, and I found that's kind of really, really important, and that's mostly what I sort of focus on. And again, often the way that I'm choosing to make images interesting is abstraction, yes, but also trying to make sure that it's obvious that there's some story involved. Alright, so hopefully that gives you at least a little bit of context and also maybe some visual inspiration, a few different ideas. Let's get into, doing some demos, right? Because I really want to make this, again, about drawing and sort of showing you how I would kind of go about doing this. Now, there's a number of things that I think you can really sort of begin with, but again, I'm mostly thinking about story, and I'm actually going to start with a very simple story. And the story can be pretty much defined as, our hero meets a stranger on the road, right? Yep, on the road. And again, that can mean whatever you want it to be. I'll talk a little bit later specifically on a few simple frameworks that you could maybe use to come up with your own stories, because again, it can be challenging to be doing this at the same time, but we'll do that in a little bit. Now, I think a really, simple way to think about this is, just to kind of start by dividing up this frame. So I'm going to come in a little bit, make sure I've got a little bit of margin around here, so again we can kind of see everything. And then what I'm going to do, again from a simple technique point of view, I've just got one hand on the side here, and I'm just going to draw sort of a faint line here. Then I'm going to do the same thing on the bottom. And yeah, I'm just kind of using it as like a little bit of a ruler. With this one, I'm just going to sort of draw that down there. And again, this is just rough. You could go with the top here, right? Again. All right, just put that along there. Boom. Make sure you don't get a paper cut. That can be a legit concern. So I'm going to do sort of 6 here, right? And yeah, gonna try sort of make them kind of maybe some sort of how are we going to do this? Yeah, I think that'll be right. Right, something roughly like this. Again, I haven't really sort of divided up a page, exactly like this before. Again, I'll just go a little bit more over here. That'll sort of be okay. And then here. Right, same thing. This stuff doesn't have to be exact. And you said you definitely sort of don't need to do it like I'm doing it. You can just sort of do them one at a time, or do them anywhere. But and again, I'll probably redo those borders in a little bit. This sort of just gives me a good framework. Now, the reason I like to sort of do this and just sort of rule up the page is it kind of tells me that I'm on a journey, right? I have to go from here, right, to here. And what we want to do is try and sort of create some interesting little sort of stories here. Now, again, who is our sort of hero? Well, I'm just going to default back to the character that we sort of have been drawing previously, which is kind of our sort of character riding this type of creature. So, you know what? I think it's actually in this book. So, sort of drawing this character here. And again, the question is kind of like, who does our character meet along the road? And, this is where I'm just going to sort of play around, right? And sort of see what I can kind of come up with. It might be good to, maybe we could just sort of play around with some, making some sort of initial sort of statements and see what we come up with. Again, I find this is often a good way to do it. Let's start with the obvious. just tell the story, right? We've got our character here. And again, I'll give you some other tips on, things that you can think about or sort of do to start. Because obviously there's a lot to unpack in this. But again, for now, let's just play around and sort of have fun, right? So in this case, right, we've just got our character and we've got this sort of giant creature, and then we sort of have the road, right? So I kind of want to make it clear, right? That sort of, this is who we are sort of meeting. Oh. So this is kind of how I will play around with this. And then what we'll do is kind of look at some of the, the basic kind of things that are sort of maybe going wrong as I, sort of take these first steps, and then see what we can do to sort of correct them, right? Because again, the first few times you do this, it's not necessarily going to go perfectly. That's totally fine. Right, so I've got a character here, and have that sort of stuff up there. And who is this character, who they are meeting, right, along the way? Well, to begin with, again, let's just make it super basic. Let's just make it another sort of warrior character, because again, I feel like the process here is, oh, that's not working. Let's do a better drawing lesson than that. So let's sort of think about where these characters are on the ground plane, right? A good way to do that is to sort of just think about where their shadows might be. Now I'm going a little bit outside the box and that kind of stuff. None of that stuff really matters. Again, this is just planning and thinking, right? Again, I feel like I'm like wanting to like sort of extend that out. Boom. And yes, I think sort of over here, right? We can sort of draw another character here, and we kind of want them to be maybe a little bit sort of bigger. Let's see if we can pull this in. Boom, boom. Again, you can be as rough as you want. And the first few times we sort of do this for an idea, again, it's going to be pretty rough. That's all good. Boom. Think about that sort of shadow. And we could do the thing I've sort of done in a few images where make sure the character kind of looks like they're holding their sword, right? So we feel like there's some sort of danger. And here, boom, again, we have this character. Now I'm going to make the character sort of short because I've sort of run out of room. Maybe I'll make them kind of hunched over again because I've sort of run out of room. And we'll just kind of have again, like the this is where again we have ideas that kind of start popping up, or at least I do. So I kind of was like, what am I going to draw on this guy's back? Because from a story perspective, again, this is my hero, but I'm sort of looking at them from behind, right? We can sort of think of this as like, here's our road, right? And again, have some trees or something like that. Just using sort of pretty simple fantasy tropes, as I'm, often want to do. It's a really good way to learn. Just stick with tropes and things that kind of work well. Again, so I'll go fully into this kind of thing. So again, I have this morbid idea here that like maybe they're all kind of headhunter sort of characters, right? Now again, does this mean this is our hero who's like chopping people's heads off or something? Like, I don't know. We're just playing around. But the question is like, what are they doing? What are they interacting over, right? Because the problem is it's kind of boring, right? It's like, oh, they're just sort of sitting there. What are they talking about? What's going on? Put down some lines. See what happens. Don't freak out, right? Like the brainstorming is so important to just let stuff fly. And again, I like the idea of sort of like this guy has maybe they're sort of hunting some sort of monstrous character, right? So it's not maybe it's slightly more virtuous, or at least we'd hope so, right? So maybe the character has some sort of, they're collecting these heads from, they're sort of hunting monsters or something like that. So again, we can maybe justify our morbidity to kind of say maybe these were, hunting young children or something like that, and our hero is sort of going to save them, right? So maybe they're kind of like literal bounty hunters. So this guy's got some heads on the back of their sort of pack. There's some here, right? We've got that same stuff that we normally have. Some other packs, other bits and pieces. And they're kind of meeting, and they're meeting this guy who also is maybe sort of a headhunter. And maybe he's kind of, maybe they're just like sort of creepy people who talk about what's going on, right? It's like they're sort of talking shop, right? They've sort of met in the middle of the forest, and they're talking about maybe where some other characters are, right? Like where, and again, here's where we could, sort of illustrate that. Maybe we could kind of, instead of this guy kind of holding it, maybe like one arm could be sort of, right? Kind of like pointing somewhere, right? Saying like over there, there's more monsters. But this guy could look a bit monstrous too, which again just kind of mixes things up a little bit, but look different from a monstrous sort of point of view to this guy. So again, think about sort of shadow under there. Now, compositionally, again, this is where something like sort of narrative design sort of trumps abstract design. But we might need to pull in those ideas of abstraction to kind of make us have clarity. So often what I find that's most important to do is to sort of place in the elements of an image like this that are the most important, and then think about how we can sort of support them abstractly via other elements that we know need to be there. So in this case, we've got sort of a character that I sort of want to feel a little bit sort of dark. I want to feel as if, again, this character is a little bit sort of shadowed. And what we could do is, again, sort of make sure that, maybe we've got some, right? We've got to sort of think about, well, we got some trees here. Is it going to be darker behind the trees? Right? Make sure we've sort of got dark, right? And again, behind the hand, let's put another sort of tree. So I'm creating compositional elements, and this is stuff that you don't have to do, right? But this is where the thumbnailing can be really useful. And once you sort of get, once you get used to these things, you read your compositional sort of texts and, start to get a little bit more comfortable with the whole process, you can start to build these things in here. But again, I have a tree behind the character, so we have a dark character with a lighter tree behind them, and then we have some sort of dark forest, because I'm imagining, again, these are creepy people who are meeting in a forest. Right? And maybe the ground is sort of light as well. Maybe there's some moonlight, right, sort of coming in, right, casting some shadows. Our main character also would be sort of pretty sort of dark, and probably the whole, you know, environment will be pretty dark. But luckily we've got this sort of white, right, this lizard thing is kind of quite bright white. So yeah, interesting. Anyway, so that's again, you know, just playing around, right? Like our character meets a stranger on the road, and again, what is it? And for the next one, again, what we can do is maybe dig further into that idea, right? Like how can we sort of go further? How can we go deeper? How can we push the story even more? And again, I hesitate to sort of dig in deeper, because again, it could get pretty sort of morbid. I don't want to get people complaining about the video on YouTube because we start drawing awful things. But again, you know, you can just kind of follow your imagination in that instance. Another thing we could try is, again, maybe like a more virtuous take on this concept. So maybe it could be that our character is meeting in a dark, you know, on a darkened path, a character who is kind of doing this, right? So again, what I'm going to do is make this a little bit sort of thinner, because I tend to like these really sort of long landscape panels like this. Now again, this page is looking a little bit sort of messy. Super easy, just get a ruler and rule these up. Again, I'm just kind of doing it, you know, by hand to show that you sort of can. Also keep in mind, normally, if I was ruling this up, I'd probably, you know, do it slightly differently, just because, but I'm doing it this way so we can sort of see it all on the camera. Just in terms of how big they are and stuff like that, I'd probably make them a little bit bigger. Might do sort of 1, right, 2, 3, and then sort of like 4, 5, 6 down here, right? But again, can't see that, so I want to keep them all there. So in this instance, I like the idea of, again, having sort of the main focus be, again, one of these characters, right, that our main sort of character is sort of coming across. And they're going to be over there. Now, the way that I sort of start blocking this out is to kind of think about, again, first thing that I want to sort of be on the page. Let's sort of figure out how much sort of room it takes up. Again, same thing here. Now, we typically read, in Western countries at least, left to right. So again, the person is traveling from left to right. Makes sense. Again, we mess with that if we want to sort of push it, but just keeping to the basics is super, super important. Right, then I have, right, what I want is to kind of have like a bit of separation between our sort of character and this sort of character, right? So what I'm going to try and do is, again, thinking about sort of where that camera is, and right, sort of what is in between me, right, being this kind of character, and this sort of thing over here. So we've just kind of got our character here. Now, is it an interesting pose? Not really. Can we change that later? Yes. Again, just explore. Maybe once I get to down here, that's where I'll be sort of saying, I've got the same idea, but I like that, but maybe I want a more action pose. Maybe I want to play around with it. Again, you can just do different ideas. You can iterate on the same thing. Whatever floats your boat, right? Whatever sort of gets you interested. So again, what I'm trying to do here is sort of make it feel as if we're sort of seeing someone from a distance. So I want like a long sort of like a large space between, right, sort of between us. So some sort of character here. Again, I like that kind of hunchback sort of look. Right, and again, maybe this character has a whole pile of sort of bounty on his back. And has kind of one kind of something here. So if you've sort of seen again any of the scenarios where I, will do a construction drawing kind of based on, one of these kind of thumbnails, there's lots of stuff we can figure out. What we're mostly trying to do is get a sense of scale, gesture, right, process, story. Like we want an idea that's kind of interesting to us. That really is the only thing that's kind of important here. So again, some sort of weird character who looks very suspicious, doing something very suspicious. Now I'm thinking about, again, what space they're occupying on the ground. That is a really good sort of way to sort of visualize what's happening. And again, we could make this character feel as if they are more maybe not just kind of like standing by. Again, we could use that same kind of thing, right, where like maybe again the character just kind of has one sort of hand on this kind of sword. Again, doesn't make it's always, again, we can figure out like left hand, right hand. Let's play around with the pose. Just stick with kind of idea first. Now what I want to try and do is separate the characters, right, in space. So I want to make it just sort of clear that this character is over here and this other character is sort of over there. So again, where is this guy? Where's this kind of where's this character, right? Same thing, right? I want to do, I've got some, right, sort of feet here. Oh. Where do they go? They don't really fit in this image at the moment. See if we can play again with that idea of the thing kind of wrapping around. Again, this could be a thing where, like this is a problem for future Tim to figure out. Could just kind of say, well, let's sort of fit him over here somewhere. Do I like the idea enough, right, to sort of progress, right? But again, instead of like in front, maybe it could be that the character is sort of, right, like this. Right, our sort of steed is kind of twisting around. Don't get rid of that. Get that. Right. And again, so like, I'm sort of thinking and I'm like, oh, maybe, yeah, I like this kind of idea. We probably just need more space, right? We really need to kind of give ourselves more room to breathe in that instance. But again, I like the idea of kind of, right, again, tree, right? So we sort of got, again, I like the feeling that kind of this guy is sort of coming out of, right, the darkness. Right, so we have sort of lost edge, right? Like this character and the dark are kind of the same. All right, some lighter trees over here. And again, I want to make it clear that we have some sort of overlapping shapes, right? So again, the fact that this sort of the lizard cat sort of creature-y thing, right, lizard horse, is kind of maybe sort of coiling, right, I think could be interesting. Again, you know, so this is a situation where we might have like 10% of the ideas from here, 10% of the ideas from here, and then, you know, we sort of keep rolling with them. And you learn things about how big or small we need these sort of different elements to be. And also to a certain degree, you know, you can use ideas that you sort of have here, you know, and here in your final image, you know, even if you only sort of, even if we sort of figure out and pick a, you know, pick a different one in the future. So again, I like the idea that, right, there's depth. Right, so we got some sort of grass or things here. Again, if you want it to be really sort of creepy, you could kind of have like some sort of blood or something like that creeping out. Right, so like there's this dark hole in the back. Right, and sort of you don't want to know what's happening in there. Anyway, so again, that's a good example of, you know, just sort of exploring different ideas. There's no right or wrong way to do this, but you know, this is kind of quite sketchy, but again, that's totally fine because it's a sort of process, not necessarily a end result. All right, so let's keep rolling and see if we can maybe, you know, sort of zoom out a little bit, but still make it feel immediate. Now, it's worth talking about, again, the idea of story. And, you know, if you're wanting to come up with your own sort of stories or little ideas for this, obviously, you know, I think the best thing to do is just think of scenarios and sort of situations where, you know, you kind of either remember good stories or, you know, you've sort of got your own ideas. You know, that's ultimately, you know, where a lot of the, you know, good is going to come here. You know, because again, this is about your story, not necessarily my story. But, you know, things that I think you can always sort of think about to inspire, you know, good options or, you know, sort of ideas are, again, just the idea of simple stories. And again, those things could be a journey. In this case, a meeting of characters or people, or just sort of something interesting that's happening. And again, you can sort of define that however you want, obviously. But in this case, again, you'll see that a lot of the stories that I sort of do are sort of fantasy adventure sort of stories, right? And again, you know, there's sort of good reason for that. So I'm just going to try the same thing, but sort of zoom out a little bit more. Right, and again, I like to play with that idea of this character, boom, right, having this kind of recoiling sort of snake-like approach. And in this case, again, what I'm going to do is have, get rid of that, have our kind of heroic character a little bit more sort of at the ready, as it were. Right, so we kind of have a sword, or again, maybe let's just kind of have the, right, the sword kind of down. Right, so it's like sort of touching the ground here, then it goes up, right, we have our sort of shadow, and here we've got, right, the right, sort of saddle and stuff there. Right, boom, boom. So again, a lot of the time, again, this is stuff where, this is just a first pass at, the anatomy, at the composition, at all of those things. It's why construction drawing, having that construction phase is so important. And it's also, why it's important to sort of view this as, separate to the actual execution phase, right? One of the most important elements here that I think again might easily be missed if you're just kind of saying like yeah cool, just sort of thumbnails or whatever, is that often what I think is important is to really sort of view like the idea phase and sort of what is possible, and like the shapes, right? Like can I sort of get some sort of cool shapes and things happening, boom boom. Right. Maybe I think this thing might be better if we sort of bring that tail in here. Then we've got some sort of cool foreground interaction. Yeah, if you're really focused on can I do this at this stage, then it can sort of rob you of the ability to make up a better idea. And so, making sure that again I know, like, look, I've kind of had a go here. I think like maybe this will kind of work, but if not, that's cool. I can figure out how to draw this later, right? If it's that good, I can I can figure it out, and that's sort of fine. We'll do it later, right? And I think that again, as I sort of said, one of the really important things to kind of realize is that I've been doing this for quite a while, just sort of coming up with little thumbnails and thinking through this. And, there's been plenty of things I've done where I'm just like, I've even tried. And I've just kind of found that, oh, you know what? I don't really know how to turn this into a proper illustration, right? Like I've got the thing, I've got the thumbnail. I think that looks good, and whenever I sort of progress forward, I'm just like, I don't know, I don't have the perspective knowledge, or didn't have the visual library, and I just would sort of, it would be a total fail, right? But again, as I progress, I can sort of do those things. But also importantly, that this is a process, right? And I might do, again, sort of six little images here. And, I might sort of say, oh, hey, this one is really cool, but hey, it's going to take too long. This one is sort of really cool, but, I don't think I can do it. Let's try to take the same idea, pick something simpler, right? Or something that's going to require a lot less drawing. And again, I think that's where the power of sort of thinking about it like this is, right? Again, there's multiple iterations of the idea of the image. So here again, I'm playing with some abstract compositional things that kind of will, just sort of tend to pop up a little bit. So again, I still like the idea of having a big tree that is going to be a little bit lighter, that is kind of framing the character. Now behind that, I want sort of predominantly dark stuff, because I've got this giant white lizard thing. And that'll be a sort of a nice frame. Again, maybe up here where I'm going to have some sort of darker elements silhouetted over there. We could put sort of another tree or something like that, and sort of go down there. And again, this is very broad, so as I go in and detail this out, there might be 20 trees back there, but these are going to be the ones that are sort of most visible. Now here I kind of have, again, what I'm visualizing as this kind of dark space. Again, I like the idea of, again, some sort of blood pooling from out there, but we sort of have this dark space here. And what I want is to make this sword light, right? So again, we could even sort of push this sword up. And compositionally, what that'll do is kind of put this bright sword against a dark, sort of shadowy thing there. And then obviously we're going to have this character here. So same sort of character here, but it's going to be here. it's so important to be able to kind of place characters within space, and this is why. This is, I've dedicated quite a bit of time on the channel to, sort of Loomis method and figure drawing construction methodologies, and, this really is why I feel like this whole idea is so important, because it's frequently the case that even when we're just planning, what I need to do is kind of say, well, I need a character kind of here, right? So I need to figure out, right, like how high they are, right? We need to kind of think about, well, if I sort of just draw some lines from the top of this head to over here, right, top of this head to over here, right? Maybe like if there was another version of this character over here, right, you might kind of be, this high. So I want this character to feel a bit bigger. So again, I'm going to sort of have them hunched over. And again, so that means I want that sort of torso to be a little bit above here, right? Sort of drawing a torso, and I'm kind of following this same idea. I'm going to have a head that I'm putting after that torso, and again, if we draw that sort of shoulder blade line, then I can visualize where that spine is there. We can sort of draw some little sort of indication of where those pelvis / hips are going to be. And then again, drawing some sort of legs here, right? And the idea is again that this sort of character is sort of a little bit hunched over, right? There's a little bit of that sort of hunchback sort of look, a little bit unnatural. Again, got shoulder here, all right? Sword there. Boom. And what else have we got? All right. Define that sort of shadow. Again, as I do the construction drawing, right, I can move this character up a little bit. I can really sort of sort this out. I just need here to get it kind of feeling right. And here we're going to have, again, sort of another tree, right, coming here. And we could have some sort of branches here that really make this feel like it is that kind of hole, right? Sort of like a bear cave or some kind of thing like that. Boom. And again, I like the idea of them kind of holding, right? Kind of holding something. Could also be that the character is kind of holding it down here, right? So it's like less kind of in the focus. It could also be that there's like, maybe there's more of them. Again, we can play around with that in future sort of versions of the idea. Boom. So again, we have sort of a character that again is kind of part of this shadow, but we'll have this kind of sword here that would be sort of light. Dark here. And again, like the idea of kind of, again, trying to tell the story of, right, there being some sort of extra foliage or bits and pieces that we can sort of define, right? Again, sort of show coming up across these different characters, right, showing that kind of depth. And also, again, maybe to sort of show the idea of there maybe being some kind of path here, right? So it's like not just sort of necessarily meeting them in the middle of nowhere. But again, a lot of those things are, often a little bit easier or better to work out later. I'm not really liking the look of how that kind of works. Again, we could just kind of think of this as more or less sort of open space, or just where we, again, tell the story of depth, right? Things overlapping things, but leave it as a bit of sort of open space. The other thing, again, that we can consider is that, potentially, some of this will be sort of in shadow, right? So we could just kind of say that, this is still just sort of grass or sort of some sort of ground, but here it's kind of in shadow, right? Again, we have the idea of moonlight coming down, something like that. So again, another sort of little sort of version of the same sort of image. Now, interestingly, again, I'm sort of leaving this pretty vague, because I've sort of got a version of it here, and this is just a very small, right? Very small little sort of sketch, right? I'm getting the limits of what I can do, easily with this kind of pencil, right? And this thing, and I'm also trying to mostly describe the fact that I kind of want the character to kind of blend into the background to a certain degree, right? So we're not quite sure what's going on, except again, we've got the idea of that kind of blood or something there. And yeah, again, that's the basic idea. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean this is white and this is black. It's just sort of planning out opportunities for where the major props will go. And as you can see, we sort of built them up around the, sort of initial sort of action. And that typically is how I think, you normally would build it. If you're a director on a film or something like that, then that's probably what you'd do. You'd put them in, you'd put them in last. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea for how this kind of process would sort of go. I think that the last sort of most important thing to really kind of consider is just the concept of, again, keeping these things simple, making sure that you keep your 1, 2, 3 read really clear. And again, as I said, place in the set pieces around the character. So if you get too stuck with sort of thinking about what the scene is going to be, and not taking advantage of the two-dimensional medium where we can kind of place things where we want, then if you get too attached to that, then it can be harder to kind of, again, place things that are light or dark where you sort of need them to be. The first thing that I'm kind of often starting with, as I said, is just sort of blocking in where one thing will go and where one thing will go, right? And then saying, well, what is the most important thing? And that's where we have the concept of a 1, 2, 3 read. The first read, or the 1, is just what's the first thing you want to look at. And in this case, it could either be this character or it could be this character. A lot of that is defined later on by the mood and the composition and the tonal layout that we kind of might, add to this. We could, adjust that sort of set, first read. But it's either, 1, 2, right? These are going to be our first and second read. And the tertiary or the third read is probably going to be the environment, right? To kind of see what's going on. And again, what you see is, as I sort of block these in, is that I focus on putting that sort of first and second read in there. And, just kind of keep it simple. Just put those things in there that need to be there. And as I said, get really good at, placing little figures that are, the right size for you at particular kind of points where you need them. I think this is one of the most important sort of elements. Now, we could sort of keep going with sort of different options, but again, I think I'll leave it there because hopefully you get the idea of the flow and how this is sort of meant to work. And what I do is I often just keep exploring, right? Keep exploring both the narrative, both the story, and again, iterating, right? Oh, this is the right kind of idea, but, it's kind of messy, right? But, once you sort of start to clarify it, once you start to warm up, you start to get a feel for like, oh, how big do things need to be? And, what's that going to look like? Also keep in mind, as I said, you can often thumbnail something that you have no hope at all of being able to execute on. That's fine. You can leave it for later, or you can try and design a simpler version of this that is going to limit the variables, limit the complexity, so that, again, you might be able to draw something that's a little bit simpler if you don't want to deal with, again, all this sort of twisting anatomy, etc. Again, just have a very sort of simple background if you don't want to have your background full of sort of castles and sort of other complicated things. We can still play around with the perspective and, all these kind of basic things as we need. Naturally, your ability to do all this is going to be improved with your general drawing ability. But again, what I found is I've been doing this for quite a while, and I was often able to sort of thumbnail out and create scenes that were well above my sort of understanding of perspective, right? There is a big stage where we connect this with the finished image. But again, what you want to think about is just sort of continuing this process, building up a series of these, as I was kind of showing in my sort of sketchbook demo. And what you want to do, is just kind of keep practicing, keep thumbnailing these things out. And you can see that these ones here are a lot rougher than some of the ones here again, but they still did the job. They just kind of gave me an idea. So some of them are a little bit more in the vein of this sort of level of clarity, but that was enough for me to sort of take it to the next level. So the idea here is to just focus on letting your ideas flow, making sure that you don't worry about whether you can execute it. Just do the best thumbnail you can and allow your mind to wander, allow yourself to come up with stories, to think about what's possible, to, if you come in with a specific idea and then again, as soon as you kind of get a little bit into it, you sort of go on a sidetrack, follow that, see where that goes. You can always come back with a relatively short amount of time and effort, and go back to that original idea, because you might have the seed of it in one of your images here. And again, this is something that I would do as a creative exercise. And as I also said, one of the things you can do is take the idea here and turn it into something that's a lot simpler. So focus on thumbnailing to create an image that is going to be simple enough or easy enough for you to sort of complete and work with. So again, that's the basic idea here. Make sure that you focus on your creativity. The idea here is to brainstorm and also to have a circuit breaker so that when you come to do your finished image, that you've had some time to contemplate it, to sit down. So, one of the things that I can genuinely say is really fun about this is that when you come back to your ideas here, it really brings you back to when you were sketching here and the ideas that you kind of had. And that can be very sort of inspiring and interesting, right? So I kind of come back here and I'm like, what was I thinking, right? What was I doing? What was going on? And it's also important to understand that not all of the time these things are going to turn out well. I've certainly got sketchbooks where a lot of these sort of things were a bit rougher. I think this is a sketchbook where I was really having trouble sort of getting going. Some of these I was just trying to be like simple character, right? Simple composition. And none of these are really things that I would look at and go like, oh yeah, that's sort of amazing, let's do that. But again, here, I think this one actually got turned into a little sketch that, I sort of made for the channel. And again, I think that's from start to finish. There's a process of that. And, you can just play around with this. You can do little sort of landscapes, whatever you want. Again, here, really trying to sort of focus on some sort of idea that I kind of forget what this was meant to be about. But as you go through these kind of things, here I've got some sort of people flying on dragons and stuff like this. And, you just kind of, experiment, play around, mess around with stuff. I think that's what sketching is about. Playing around with, like what things should look like, etc. And explore, have fun, brainstorm, and don't worry about, the execution, right? How we're actually going to do these things. Worry about that later. And again, just brainstorm, let your ideas flow, come up with your own stories. I think this is one of the best, most sort of fun things that you can do with your art. And it does take a little bit of practice. You do have to get used to sort of drawing small. And if you're sort of struggling to get to this phase, again, I really recommend that sort of other video that I put out that sort of, talked about how to, if we sort of get it up, sort of plan some of these things out a little bit more. So check that one out as well. And hopefully this has been inspiring. Let me know if you got any sort of questions or comments below. Be really keen to, hear whether this has sort of been helping you. Or inspiring you to come up with some of these ideas yourself. But other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.